By the time the Karthik Empire dragged Commander Elena Voss onto the interrogation deck in binders and blood, every law between the stars had already been broken. She had been traveling under Council seal aboard an inspection cutter in a neutral corridor watched by 3 treaty beacons and 2 foreign observers when the Karthik cruiser Harrow of Kings cut across her bow, burned through her engines, vented her escort into vacuum, and boarded with shock pikes like pirates pretending to be a government. The footage spread across the relay nets in less than 6 minutes. A human officer in formal black service uniform, one sleeve scorched, cheek split open, forced to her knees beneath the gold crest of an empire that had sworn before the Galactic Council to respect parley, medical transit, and diplomatic passage. The first message from Karthik Command followed immediately after. Earth would withdraw from the Helios Reach, surrender its patrol rights in the corridor, and acknowledge Karthik's sovereignty over 3 inhabited systems, or Commander Voss would be tried as a spy under Imperial war codes. Not prisoner of war, not detainee, spy. The difference was deliberate, obscene, and unmistakable. A line had not merely been crossed, it had been paraded on every screen in the galaxy. Most powers expected humanity to break the way younger civilizations always broke. Panic first, fury second, please after that. The Karthiks had built their whole strategy on that assumption. Humans had been in the Council less than 70 years, and although they had fought pirates, put down fringe insurgencies, and pushed slavers out of the Perseid lanes with cold efficiency, they still carried the reputation of a species more interested in treaties than conquest. They built hospitals faster than fortresses. They sent engineers before soldiers. Their admirals spoke in measured tones. Their diplomats cited law down to the clause, and their cargo fleets supplied half the frontier with reactor parts, grain cultures, atmosphere processors, and the dull, invisible necessities that kept worlds alive. To old empires, that looked like softness. To the Karthiks, it looked like dependence. They had spent a decade calling humanity a commercial civilization with delusions of military parity, a people too moral to be feared and too procedural to be dangerous. So when their generals needed a crisis to rally their fracturing border clans, they chose the easiest target they thought existed: one human officer, one manufactured charge, one public humiliation, and one frightened Earth forced to trade law for blood. Commander Voss did not help the illusion. When they dragged her upright for questioning, she looked small beneath the chamber's towering banners and armored guards. The Karthik interrogator, Strategist Malrek, circled her like a lecturer addressing a dim student. He told her the Council would issue complaints, and Earth would issue threats, but in the end, all civilizations bowed to arithmetic. A life for territory. An officer for a corridor. Pride for survival. Behind him, the viewports showed the pale bands of the neutral route where her escort had died. Malrek wanted terror from her. He wanted a plea he could replay. Instead, Voss tasted blood, lifted her head, and asked whether he understood what the Council seals on her shuttle had meant. He laughed and said they meant nothing inside imperial necessity. She held his gaze a moment longer than most captives could endure, and answered quietly enough that the guards had to lean in to hear it. "If you had killed me in battle," she said, "Earth would have buried me. If you had received me in peace, Earth would have saluted you. But you put chains on a human officer under truce. You didn't seize leverage. You erased your future." Malrek struck her across the face for that. He should not have done it on camera. He really should not have smiled after. At Orison Ring, where the Galactic Council sat beneath a dome of old stars and older lies, the first reaction was exactly what Karthik planners expected. Outrage in speeches, emergency motions, calls for restraint. Delegations huddled in lacquered chambers and whispered about proportionality, regional stability, and the danger of letting a border seizure trigger a sector war. Several governments urged Earth to make temporary concessions and save the officer first, then pursue redress later. That, too, was expected. Human history, many believed, had made them emotional about their soldiers. Surely they would value one life above strategic position. Surely they would bargain. The council chamber fell silent when the Terran ambassador arrived, not because he shouted, because he did not. Ambassador Jonah Hale entered in plain diplomatic gray, carrying no notes, and requested the floor with the precision of a clerk finalizing an account. He cited the treaty articles violated: neutral passage, protected status, medical access, extraterritorial immunity under council seal, unlawful broadcast coercion, summary execution threat. Then he announced that the Solar Accord signatories recognized the Karthik Act not as a detention dispute, but as an assault on sovereign Terran command under witness. He informed the chamber that all Terran civilian traffic beyond humanitarian lanes was now suspended, all shared navigational libraries withdrawn, all reactor maintenance contracts paused, all strategic exports frozen, and all Terran representatives recalled from Karthik space, effective immediately. Then he looked up at the tiers of alien faces and delivered the sentence that changed the temperature of the room. Earth will not negotiate for Commander Voss, he said. Earth will answer the act. And with that, every human delegation rose and walked out together. It took 11 minutes for the first consequences to begin. Terran-flagged freighters disappeared from the major trade grids as if a whole species had stepped backward out of reality. Automated servicing agreements expired across frontier docks. Human traffic control algorithms went dark. The civilian astrogation patches that corrected drift in older non-human jump drives stopped updating. Fuel stations in 12 sectors began rejecting Karthik transponder codes. Repair berths suspended access to Terran-manufactured parts. None of those systems had ever been marketed as strategic leverage. That was part of the genius. For years, humanity had embedded itself in the unglamorous bloodstream of interstellar civilization, not by seizing colonies or terrorizing neighbors, but by becoming competent in every function others considered beneath imperial dignity. They hauled freight, standardized connectors, built emergency shelters on frozen moons and desalination towers on dust worlds. They trained medics, auditors, navigators, and traffic coordinators by the millions. Most species saw only the surface, helpful humans making themselves useful. What they had not seen was the architecture beneath it. Every logistics web is a map. Every supply contract is access. Every routine maintenance call is an intimacy with someone else's weakness. While the council argued over wording, the Karthik frontier began to understand what it meant when the hands that kept a machine running simply folded. Still the Empire laughed. They had warships, planetary shields, marine legions, and mass drivers buried in ring forts around 100 worlds. They held the officer. They controlled the broadcast. Their admirals dismissed the disruptions as temporary inconvenience and ordered the hostages' trial accelerated. Across Karthik territory, propaganda ministries replayed the image of Commander Voss kneeling under chains, adding triumphant captions about human submission and imperial justice. Crowds cheered. Governors toasted. The Harrow of Kings was praised as the spear point of a new era. Then, 23 hours after the capture, 16 Karthik border stations ceased transmitting at the exact same second. Not attacked, silenced. Their crews were found later alive, locked in secure rooms with their weapons stripped, their reactors safed, and a single Terran phrase burned onto every command console in their own language. Stand down and live. 3 minutes after that, 2 jump relays inside undisputed Karthik space detonated with such surgical precision that surrounding habitats were untouched, but fleet traffic across an entire arm of the Empire collapsed into blind delay. No Terran warships had crossed the border, at least none that scanners could identify. Karthik intelligence blamed sabotage cells, then mercenaries, then Council treachery. None of those explanations survived the next hour. The next hour belonged to the doctrine no one had known Earth possessed. Deep in archival law libraries, hidden behind dry strategic language and ignored by almost everyone who had skimmed the Soul Accords, there was a principle first drafted after humanity's oldest age of nation-states had nearly killed itself. It had been revised for interstellar law, ratified in silence, and never invoked. Its formal name was Continuity of Command Response. Across military academies, however, it had another name: the real answer. The doctrine held that a uniformed Terran officer traveling under legal protection was not merely an individual, but a living node in sovereign command. To publicly seize such an officer outside declared war was to announce that law had been replaced by coercive spectacle. Under those conditions, Earth was not obligated to trade, threaten, or posture. It was permitted to execute total command restoration by any proportional means necessary until the offending state no longer possessed the capability to repeat the act. Not revenge, not rescue. Restoration. It was a terrible distinction because it meant the goal was never one hostage. The goal was to break the hand that had decided hostages were useful. For nearly a century, no one had tested whether humanity meant it. The Karthiks had. That was their mistake. When the Terran fleet finally appeared, the galaxy almost missed the moment. There was no glorious armada rising over a planet, no obvious charge across a border. The first confirmed sighting came from a dock worker on a forgotten Karthik depot world who noticed that 12 inert freight barges parked in customs orbit had shifted formation. Their hull plating split open along old cargo seams, and from inside emerged rail spines, missile lattices, drone cradles, and sensor masts so advanced the local defense grid misclassified them as debris until its own targeting software was overwritten. On another world, a civilian refinery tender blew ballast panels and unfolded into a carrier spine. At a relay junction 50 light-years away, maintenance capsules attached for years to a comm tower detached, linked, and ignited drives powerful enough to rip the tower's military uplink apart. Humans had spent decades moving goods, evacuating refugees, building depots, leasing cargo berths, and parking auxiliary hulls in hundreds of systems. Nobody had objected, because nobody had bothered to imagine that the species renowned for logistics had made logistics itself into a weapon. The Terran Navy people feared in old strategic debates was not the Navy that mattered. The real Terran fleet had been there all along, sleeping under customs manifests and insurance codes, wrapped in the humble skin of commerce.
Then the war turned from surprising to horrifying. Not because humans lost control, but because they never did. Karthik admirals attempted sector-wide mobilization and found their encrypted command links spoofed, delayed, or selectively severed. Squadrons racing to reinforce the border dropped out of jump into minefields assembled hours earlier by drones launched from merchant grain haulers. Planetary shield hubs received false thermal data, vented coolant in the wrong sequence, and fell offline just long enough for Terran strike packages to punch through their defense rings and disable weapons before reactivating local emergency power. On the moon of Varrock, an Imperial Marine division woke to every armored vehicle fused at the ignition matrix by microscopic charges hidden in imported maintenance kits. At Halcyon Gate, a Karthic battlecruiser fired on what it thought was a Terran destroyer and discovered too late it had targeted a decoy buoy, while 3 real Terran hunters rose beneath its own keel and drove breaching lances straight into its reactor collar. City populations were bypassed. Hospitals were marked safe and left untouched. Water processors were protected by Terran drone swarms from panicked local bombardment. The pattern was unmistakable and psychologically devastating. Humanity was not lashing out. Humanity had audited the Empire, itemized its arteries, and begun closing fingers around each one in a sequence planned long before the first shot. The message came through every surviving military channel in Terran, Karthic, and Council Standard. This operation remains limited. Return, Commander Voss. Surrender all officers in the chain of seizure. Dissolve contested claims. Fail, and the restoration continues. The Council tried to intervene once the casualty reports started becoming impossible to spin. Delegations that had urged patience now demanded a ceasefire before the Karthic state collapsed. Emergency envoys requested simultaneous de-escalation. A famous Pelasian jurist argued that, whatever the original violation, Earth's response was destabilizing the entire legal order. Ambassador Hale returned to the chamber long enough to answer that one. He stood beneath the same dome, with fresh rec data still scrolling across the chamber walls, and asked the council what exactly they thought law was for. Was it a decoration worn in peace and discarded in humiliation? Was it a plea the weak made to the violent? Or was it the agreed boundary between civilization and predation? Then he said the thing many later claimed had chilled them more than any fleet footage. "We are not destroying law," he said.
"We are proving it has teeth."
He reminded them that Earth had not struck neutral worlds, had not targeted civilians, had not hidden its conditions, and had not made a single demand beyond the surrender of those responsible and the restoration of the seized officer. Every Terran action, he said, had been logged, time-stamped, and legally certified for eventual tribunal review. Missiles with footnotes, boarding actions with evidence packets, whole admiralties dismantled under article citations. The Council had never seen war waged like that, clean enough to be defensible, ruthless enough to be unforgettable. Several governments stopped speaking after that. A few began quietly moving their own officers out of any jurisdiction where humans might one day need to retrieve them. On the Harrow of Kings, Commander Voss listened to the Empire come apart through the deck vibrations. She did not see the whole war, only fragments. Boots running at all hours, orders screamed in corridor tongues, power fluctuations. One panicked junior officer vomiting beside a bulkhead after watching 3 Imperial fleets go dark on the same tactical screen. Malrek returned more than once, and each visit cost him another layer of certainty. At first he accused her of lying, of exaggerating human resolve, of bluffing about consequences. Then he accused Earth of barbarism. Then he stopped accusing and simply demanded to know how. How had Terran ships penetrated sealed inner systems? How had supply caches become arsenals? How had code keys been compromised? Voss, face bruised purple, wrists raw from restraint fields, answered with the same control that had enraged him from the beginning. "Because you thought visible strength was all strength," she said. "Because you mistook patience for passivity. Because you believed a species that values law will not kill to defend it." He told her the Emperor would never kneel to human threats. She leaned closer despite the guards and asked whether the Emperor understood that his admirals were already fighting blind, whether he knew 3 of his provincial governors had offered conditional surrender to preserve their populations, whether he had been informed that the Terrans were capturing command staff alive on purpose. Malrek froze at that. Alive on purpose changed everything. Dead enemies inspire revenge. Living officers become witnesses.
Desperate to restore control, the Karthik throne issued the one order any calmer mind would have recognized as suicide. Commander Voss was to be transferred to the imperial capital and executed before the Hall of Mandates in a live legal ritual, proving that Karthik's sovereignty remained intact. The Harrow of Kings broke from its escort screen and ran under emergency drives toward the core, shielded by 3 heavy cruisers and a carrier group pulled from Homeland Defense. For the first time since the crisis began, the Terrans responded immediately, but not by rushing a rescue flotilla along the same route. They opened every civilian channel in the surrounding sectors and broadcast safe corridors for non-combatants. Then, Terran strike groups fell on the escort from 4 vectors at once, not to annihilate it, but to herd it. Ships were disabled, not vaporized. Drives were sheared, sensor masts snapped. Escape arcs were shaped like corridors. The carrier group, believing it had found an opening, ran straight toward the gravity shadow of the dead moon Orist, where 57 decommissioned freight containers anchored years earlier around an ore relay suddenly woke, assembled, and became a siege lattice. What followed lasted 9 minutes and entered every war college in the galaxy. The Karthik carrier launched 400 strike craft. The Terran lattice killed none of them at range. It blinded them, cut their comms, hijacked their navigation, and sent them drifting harmlessly past the battle while marine breachers punched through the carrier's spine and took the bridge intact. One Terran boarding transmission survived the electronic storm and made it into the archives. "This is Captain Imani Solis of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. Your vessel is under lawful seizure. Stand down your weapons and your medics will be protected." No roar. No hatred, just procedure. The Harrow still ran, badly damaged now, but running, trying to drag its hostage into the symbolic center of the Empire. Malrek stood on the bridge with execution orders in hand when the stars outside the forward screen bent, not exploded, bent. A line of darkness cut across the void ahead, thin as a blade edge, and from it emerged the first openly declared Terran capital ships of the war. They were not the biggest vessels in known space. They did not need to be. Their hulls were black geometric slabs built around engine mass and absurdly dense spinal guns. The kind of ships designed by people who did not care how pretty power looked, so long as it arrived on time. At their center sailed the TDF Resolute, flagship of the Home Reserve, a vessel so rarely seen in public that many analysts had believed it to be a ceremonial fiction. It hailed the Harrow on all military bands. Admiral Nkiru Adeyemi appeared on screen in service white, silver hair braided close, expression almost tranquil. "Karthik vessel Harrow of Kings," she said. "You are in unlawful possession of Commander Elena Voss of the Terran Officer Corps. Cut drives, vent weapons, prepare to transfer your prisoner and surviving senior staff for tribunal transport." Malrek, whatever else he was still an Imperial commander. He ordered fire. The first Karthik broadside hit nothing. The Resolute had moved before the gunners understood it had moved. The return shot did not destroy the Harrow. It cut through the 3 decks beneath the bridge, severed the ship's spine, killed main thrust, and left the command section tumbling but pressurized. A second volley from the Terran escorts sliced off the weapon pods with such precision the surviving Karthik crew later described it as being disarmed by surgeons. Terran Marines reached Voss 4 minutes after breach. They found her sitting upright in a half-dark detention chamber while smoke drifted through the ventilation grills. A dead guard floated against the ceiling where decompression had caught him. Another lay moaning with a shattered leg. Voss had used a broken restraint pin to open the emergency med locker and was tying a pressure bandage around that same guard's thigh. The first Marine through the door stopped long enough to stare. "Commander," he said, lowering his rifle a fraction, "we're here to recover you." She looked up, calm through blood and wreckage, and answered, "Then recover the wounded, too." That order passed through the boarding channels all the way back to the Resolute. It mattered. In the hours that followed, as Karthik state media failed and surviving command staffs were rounded up, footage began leaking from both sides. Not just the capture anymore. The rescue. Human Marines carrying injured enemy crew to triage. Terran medics stabilizing the very officers who had ordered the hostage seizure. Commander Voss refusing evacuation until the detention block had been cleared. Admiral Adeyemi sending surrender instructions directly to Karthik planetary defense councils, along with guarantees for civilian infrastructure. Humanity's wrath had not turned them into monsters. That frightened the galaxy more than if it had. Discipline under outrage, restraint under power, violence aimed like a needle instead of a storm. There was nothing chaotic to bargain with. By the 7th day, the Karthik Empire existed mostly as a map with obsolete coloring. Its outer fleets were disarmed or surrounded. Its communications were partitioned by Terran control nodes. Its governors were split between surrender, denial, and open denunciation of the throne. The Emperor himself finally requested council mediation, not from strength, but from a bunker beneath a palace whose shield generators were being held offline by remote Terran code injections every time engineers tried to restart them. Earth agreed to talks under 3 conditions. Unconditional release and return of all surviving detainees from the original seizure. Surrender of every official in the chain of command from boarding order to propaganda authorization. And formal admission before the Council that the Karthik Empire had violated interstellar law in an act of coercive piracy under false sovereign claim. The Emperor stalled for 6 hours. During that time, the Terrans captured 2 more admiralties, froze the treasury nodes that paid frontier mercenaries, and transmitted evacuation coordinates to civilian districts surrounding the Imperial military quarter. He signed after that. Not because his people were being slaughtered, they were not. He signed because every instrument of organized violence he still possessed had become unusable in his hands. Earth had not invaded to conquer. Earth had demonstrated that it could reach into the machinery of empire and switch off war without asking permission. Once seen, that could not be unseen. The council chamber was fuller than it had been in generations, when Commander Elena Voss returned under honor guard. Species that had mocked human legalism now stood as she entered. Species that had advised compromise kept their eyes lowered. The Karthik signatories gave their confession through trembling translators, while Terran evidence arrays projected every timestamp, every order chain, every falsified legal claim, every doctored broadcast segment, every casual laugh before the first strike. When it ended, silence lingered like smoke. Then the presiding speaker asked Commander Voss whether Earth considered justice satisfied. She looked not at the Karthiks, but at the assembled galaxy. Her face was healed enough to hide the worst of the damage, though the thin scar across her cheek would remain. Justice, she said, is not the same thing as memory. She spoke of treaties, of the purpose of uniform, of why protected passage existed at all. Not to shelter the powerful, she said, but to preserve the possibility of civilization between enemies. If that principle failed, every parley became a trap, and every rescue ship a target. Humanity had answered not because it loved war, but because it understood what kind of universe emerged when humiliation became policy. Then she finished with the sentence that every academy, embassy, and throne world archived before the day was done. "You may think humans are dangerous when angry," she said. "You should be more afraid of what we become when we are certain." Afterward, the stories multiplied the way all true nightmares do. Some said the Terrans had planned the whole thing years in advance and were only waiting for someone foolish enough to justify it. Some said every human cargo ship in the galaxy was secretly a warship now. Some said Terran officers carried deadman codes that could wake entire dormant fleets with a heartbeat. Most of those rumors were exaggerated. That hardly mattered. The truth was already severe enough. The Karthik state survived in diminished form under inspections, reparations, and a generation of military restrictions. Several rival empires quietly revised their hostage doctrines to exclude all humans under all circumstances. Neutral powers rewrote parley law with new enforcement clauses, drafted largely by Terran jurists. Human military academies received a flood of foreign observers, suddenly desperate to understand the civilization they had mistaken for merely competent. And whenever Terran diplomats entered a chamber after that, the room listened differently. The easy condescension was gone. The patronizing smiles vanished. People had seen what lay beneath the patient tone, the trade agreements, the relief fleets, the endless procedural language. Not softness, structure. Not sentiment, resolve engineered over centuries into something colder than pride and more durable than fear. Humanity had always wanted peace. The galaxy had finally learned that this was not because humans were harmless. It was because humans knew exactly what it cost when peace failed. Long after the debris was cleared from the Helios Reach and the last tribunal verdicts were entered into law, one image remained in the cultural memory of 1,000 worlds. Commander Elena Voss, kneeling in chains beneath the banner of an empire that believed it had captured one person, followed by that same empire kneeling under its own confession, while Earth stood silent and unshaken. That was the real answer in the end. Not the railgun strikes, not the hidden fleets, not the sabotage webs or shattered admiralties. Those were methods. The answer was simpler and far more terrifying. Humans did not treat their people as expendable tokens, and they did not allow law to become theater for predators. If you crossed that line, they would not scream and they would not beg. They would become patient, organized, impossibly thorough, and they would keep going until the lesson was carved into the bones of your civilization. After Karthik, nobody in the galaxy ever again confused human restraint with weakness. They learned too late that when you put chains on one officer of Earth, you put a target on your entire empire.